I always believed that moving in with my daughter after my hip surgery would be a blessing. I thought it would bring us closer, that I could lend her a hand, that I would finally see her happy with the man she loved. But in the quiet early hours of a suburban morning outside Seattle, I silently left that house terrified by what I had just discovered about my daughter's husband. And if you think a 68-year-old woman no longer has the strength to change her own fate, then you've never seen what a mother can do. Stay until the end, because what happened next sounds like something out of a movie, but it's completely real. My name is Julie Anderson, 68 years old. After a lifetime of sacrifice for my family, all I ever wanted was a little peace. But in that house, I found everything except peace. It all began when I moved in with my daughter, Natalie, and her husband, Edward, in their elegant two-story home in a quiet neighborhood north of the city. I'd never liked depending on anyone, not even when I broke my ankle at 40, and the neighbors offered to help carry my groceries upstairs. I refused. But after surgery, I couldn't do everything the way I used to. I was tired of pretending to be strong. Natalie begged me to stay with them for a few weeks so she could take care of me. "You'll recover faster, Mom," she said softly, but I could hear something strangely rushed in her voice. I agreed, because deep down, I still wanted to be closer to her. Between us were years of distance, short phone calls, dinners canceled at the last minute because of work. I thought living together might heal us, bring us back to the days when we watched movies in our small apartment, eating popcorn and laughing out loud. But Natalie's house was nothing like that now, spacious, quiet, polished, and so luxurious, it made me feel small. The living room had gleaming hardwood floors, a modern kitchen with an automatic coffee maker, and a shining, double-door fridge, like in a hotel. Everything smelled of success. My room had a thick mattress, gold-stitched pillows, and a large window overlooking a rose garden. I sat on the edge of the bed, grateful, yet misplaced, as if I'd been dropped into a world that wasn't mine. I smiled, thanked them, and tried to look happy, but my intuition whispered this wouldn't last long. Natalie was as busy as ever, leaving early, coming home late, eating dinner in a rush before burying herself in her laptop. She said Edward was glad I came, but his eyes told a different story. Edward was polite but cold. He never looked me in the eye. His good morning felt like a formality, not warmth. One evening, I heard him laughing loudly in the living room while I was trying to sleep. A laugh without joy, only something unsettling behind it. During those first nights, I couldn't sleep. The bed was soft, but the silence was suffocating. Neighbors chatting. So this perfect stillness felt unnatural. Sometimes the lavender oil Natalie burned made me dizzy. I often woke in the middle of the night, grabbed my cane, and walked down the hallway just to remind myself I still existed. One night, I noticed the living room light still on. I went out, turned it off, and stood still, looking around. Everything was spotless, glossy, picture perfect, but I didn't belong. I was grateful to have a roof over my head, yet the place made it hard to breathe. Edward spoke little, and when he did, his words were sharp. During dinner once, he joked, "You have to be careful with older people, just one fall, and that's the end." He laughed. Natalie didn't react. She didn't even look at me. I swallowed hard and pretended not to hear. I wondered, had she grown so used to his words that she no longer noticed, or was she just choosing to ignore them? On Sundays, when I hoped for breakfast together, they always had other plans, parties, work, friends. I was left alone with my cup of cold coffee. Once, Edward invited his business friends over. They opened champagne, laughed about contracts, stocks, yachts, and vacation homes. No one asked me a single question. I stood there with a faint smile. then quietly returned to my room. I lay down and cried silently, the kind of crying that belongs to someone who's long been lonely. Natalie still called me Mom, but her voice sounded more like duty than affection. One evening I said, "If you need space, I can leave," she replied without looking up. "Don't be ridiculous, Mom." That house was warm in comfort, but cold in soul. The dining room sparkled with its crystal chandelier, yet no one asked if I was okay, if I'd slept well, or if my surgical wound still hurt. Sometimes I wrote little letters and hid them in empty tea tins, things I couldn't say out loud, because if I did, I'd cry. One of them read, "I'm here, but I feel invisible." The worst part was, I began to get used to that invisibility. It hurt less than hoping for care that never came. I chose silence because speaking only made me feel even more alone. One night, after a long day, I stepped into the hallway. I stopped in the living room. Everything was as perfect as ever. I sat down on the deep blue velvet chair, looked up at the sparkling crystal chandelier, and realized something. Edward had never said my name. Not Julie, not Mom, just her, cold, distant. As if I were merely another object in this flawless house. At that moment, I understood that I had entered this home hoping for rest, but in truth, I was living inside a new wound, and I began to feel that someone was watching me. Not with hatred, but with a gaze that made my skin crawl as if they knew something I didn't. It was a subtle feeling like being an outsider in a luxury boutique, knowing you can't afford anything there, but still pretending you belong. Edward began dropping small remarks. Not cruel, but so repetitive they seeped into my skin. Things like, "Out of hot water again after your shower?" Or, "Funny how the TV remote disappears right when guests come over." He'd say it while glancing at me with a half smile. I'd smile back, the kind that only moves your face, not your heart. Every time he spoke, my body flinched, a reflex born from years of quiet endurance. Natalie, my daughter, didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she chose not to. I watched her from a distance, lost in her work, Zoom meetings, and piles of papers spread across the marble kitchen counter. Sometimes she'd look up and ask softly yet distantly, "Are you comfortable, Mom?" And I would always reply, "Yes, I'm fine," even though inside I wanted to say 100 things, but none felt safe enough to speak. How could I tell her that I felt like an old decoration in this modern house? How could I admit that the only conversation I had every morning was with the coffee machine, the hiss of steam, preparing Edward's cappuccino? To ease the loneliness, I began to write. At first, just a few scattered lines, then letters to Natalie, or to myself. Some I never dared to reread, because they were filled with bitterness I was afraid to face. I wrote in a small notebook hidden inside a wooden box my mother had given me before she passed. Among fake pearls and a silver necklace I no longer wore, I poured out everything I couldn't say. One night, I wrote, "I'm slowly disappearing, and no one notices." Then I cried. Cried until the scar on my hip ached again. I felt old, but more than that, invisible. A kind of loneliness no embrace, no song, could heal. Edward followed a strict routine: gym, shower, expensive wood-scented cologne, then sitting on his leather chair, reading financial news. Every time I walked by, that scent felt like a warning. This is my territory. Once, I overheard him tell Natalie he felt uncomfortable sharing space. He didn't say my name, but his raised brows and tight lips said enough. Another night, when I went to the kitchen for water, I heard Edward's voice in the living room, low but clear. He laughed a soft, cold laugh full of calculation that made my hair stand on end. She won't be here for long. Don't worry. It's almost ours now. I froze, leaned against the wall to keep from falling. A chill ran down my spine, not from the air conditioning, but from fear. He was talking about me, about the house, about Natalie. I didn't understand everything, but the uncertainty was more terrifying than the truth. From that day on, I began noticing everything: the sound of doors closing, the pauses between their words, the way he looked at my daughter a second too long. Natalie spoke less, her eyes distant. When I didn't eat much, she'd ask casually, "Not hungry, Mom. Just soup tonight," I'd reply. "Whatever you want," she'd answer without looking up. I wanted to ask what was wrong, to know if she was okay, but there was never a right moment. Every time I tried, Edward appeared with that overpowering cologne, his crisp shirt, and the smug smile of a man who believed he controlled everything. And I went silent again like I always had. I began to fear making noise, fear taking up space. I woke earlier than everyone else, just to avoid him in the kitchen. I dressed quietly, moving through the house like a shadow. There were days when even the reflection in the mirror no longer wanted to show me. The glass grew dim, as if it too had begun to forget my face. In one journal entry, I wrote, "I'm fading away." And that hurt more than the surgical wound, because that could be stitched. But this invisible wound could not. One Thursday afternoon, as I was slowly sweeping the porch facing the garden, I saw Edward wrap his arms around Natalie from behind. She smiled the forced smile of someone who knows she's supposed to be happy but isn't. Edward kissed her cheek. I watched through the glass, feeling like a stranger in the very house I'd helped Natalie build. Yes, I'd worked my whole life so my daughter could go to college, so she could earn that degree now framed on her office wall, a symbol of effortless success. That evening, after dinner with grilled salmon and white wine, I went to my room, locked the door, turned off the light, and prayed. Not for myself, but for Natalie, because something deep inside me whispered that things were not right. Beneath the perfect polish of the house and their soft-spoken words, something was cracking. I began dreaming of my old home, small, warm, full of laughter and crooked picture frames. I woke up in tears, wiped them away with the edge of my blanket, and promised myself that in the morning, I'd talk to my daughter. I would tell her what I'd seen, what I'd felt, just to prove that my voice still existed. But that morning never came. I never cared for big parties, expensive gifts, or multi-tiered birthday cakes. I always believed real love lived in small gestures. A hot cup of coffee, a flower picked from the garden, or simply the words, "I'm thinking of you." So when I woke up that morning and remembered it was my 68th birthday, I didn't expect much, just a hug, a simple greeting, but the first thing I heard was Edward's voice from the kitchen. "Out of almond milk again? This house can never stay organized." A chill ran down my spine. Natalie came out right after, dressed neatly in a silk dress she usually wore for important meetings. She kissed my forehead lightly, the way one kisses a child before heading to work, and said, "Let's go out tonight, Mom. You deserve a beautiful evening." Then she left, leaving behind a faint trace of vanilla perfume in the air, a scent that made my heart ache, because I'd grown used to not seeing her around. I sat in the kitchen, holding a cup of cold coffee, wondering if she truly remembered my birthday or if she was simply doing what society said she should. Edward said nothing. No happy birthday. I stayed silent the entire day, read a few pages of a book, walked slowly down the hallway, then sat on the porch, looking at the lemon tree they'd planted in the yard, a decorative tree, bearing no fruit, but pretty beside the wicker chairs and ivory cushions. A while later, Edward left the house, carrying a white shopping bag with the logo of Langford and Hale, the luxury boutique where Natalie often bought high heels. I found it odd. Maybe a gift for my daughter, I thought. Or maybe, just maybe, a birthday gift for me. But 2 hours later, he returned empty-handed. That evening, the dining room was set like a formal dinner party. Crystal glasses, linen napkins, scented candles glowing. Natalie smiled at me and said, "I made lobster. Risotto for you, Mom." For a moment, I truly felt loved. I sat on the upholstered chair, took a deep breath, and silently gave thanks. We spoke little, just polite exchanges. Natalie asked how I was feeling. I answered, "Just fine." Edward raised his wine glass and said shortly, "To health." He never mentioned me. No happy birthday. No word that made me feel seen. Throughout dinner, I searched for a sign, a gift, a small gesture to show this day meant something. But there was nothing, only expensive food, fine china, and the aching sense that I was sitting in the wrong chair. Natalie looked at me now and then, her eyes soft but hurried, as if wishing dinner would end soon so she could move on to something else. Edward stayed silent, eating slowly, sipping wine in short gulps, eyes fixed on his phone. When they brought out the cake, a small one topped with cream and red fruit, they sang, "Happy Birthday," out of habit. Natalie clapped a few times. Edward smiled. Faintly, as if at a meeting, I blew out the candle, silently wishing that one day someone would truly see me. They handed me a slice, but I couldn't bring myself to taste it. The sweetness made me nauseous, and the silence in that room suffocated me even more. I sat still, staring at Natalie's hands, the same fragile hands I once held carefully, afraid to hurt her. Now, they wore white gold rings and a thin diamond bracelet. A bracelet I had never seen before, certainly not mine, nor a wedding gift. And then I understood. The Langford and Hale bag wasn't for me, and it wasn't for Natalie either. My throat tightened. I quietly went upstairs. No tears. I didn't have the strength to cry anymore. I just lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, remembering birthdays long ago when Natalie was little, giving me crayon drawings, kissing my cheek, and saying, "You're the best mom in the whole world." I wondered, when did that stop being true? When did I cease to be the center of my daughter's world and become just an extra room in her house? That night, I woke up to use the bathroom. On my way back, I passed the office. The door was slightly open. On the desk, I saw the folded white shopping bag, a jewelry store receipt, and an open, empty box. I quietly closed the door without making a sound. My feet felt icy, and my heart heavy, not because I didn't receive a gift, but because I knew he had bought one. It just wasn't for me or for my daughter. There are nights you never forget, not for what they give, but for what they take away. That night, the silence felt different, not the kind I had grown used to in this house. It was thicker, heavier, as if something was about to break. I jolted awake without knowing why. I sat up, feeling the cold creep through my feet, and knew I wouldn't fall back asleep. I grabbed my cane and walked toward the door. Everything was dark, except for a faint light from the living room. When I got there, a lamp was still on the one beside the dark walnut shelf. I had always thought that lamp was special, a base of green agate stone, and a rough linen shade, elegant in a quiet way, never showy. I was about to switch it off when something made me stop. Among the sets of encyclopedias, I saw a thick black book, almost hidden. I had never seen it before. The cover was fake leather. No title, No author's name, just a faded gold line. Something told me this was not an ordinary book. I carefully pulled it out, held it in my hands, and sat on the sofa. My heart pounded. When I opened the first page, it felt like my soul dropped to the bottom of a well. It wasn't papers or contracts, it was photographs. Dozens of them, printed in sharp color. In the first picture, Edward was holding a young woman with light brown hair and a radiant smile. They were somewhere luxurious, looked like a seaside resort. I recognized the style right away. White lounge chairs, tall glasses, an infinity pool reflecting, rows of palm trees. Maui. I thought I'd seen it in a travel magazine at the hospital. I flipped through the pages. Each photo was clearer than the last lavish dinners. High ceilings with chandeliers, candle-lit tables set with crystal glasses. And in every one of them, he was with her. Edward wore linen shirts, designer pants, expensive watches, the confident smile I had never seen him give anyone at home. I covered my mouth as if that could stop the truth from spilling out, as if closing my eyes could keep the world from collapsing. But no, this wasn't a fleeting affair. This was another life. A plan built with time, money, and deceit. Some of the photos were recent. One showed a dinner with a bottle of sparkling wine, the kind Edward only opened for special occasions. Another showed them inside a luxury boutique with the same white shopping bag I'd seen on my birthday, the one that later disappeared. And tucked between the photos were worse things small. Handwritten notes, unsigned, written in soft, rounded handwriting that clearly wasn't Natalie's. One read, "I can't stand sharing you anymore. I miss you every night." Another said, "When it's just us, everything will be better." My hands trembled, my heart pounded in my throat. On the very last page, one chilling line froze my blood. "The plan is almost done. She doesn't suspect a thing." I felt sick, as if the ground tilted beneath me, as if the air itself had turned toxic. I closed the album and pressed it to my chest. I didn't know what I was feeling: fear, rage, despair, maybe all of them. I stood up slowly, as if my soul had turned to ashes. I placed the album back where I found it, turned off the light, and returned to my room without looking back. On my way, I could only whisper over and over, "No, no, no." I sat on my bed, staring into the darkness ahead. The tears wouldn't come. They were stuck somewhere between my chest and stomach. I wanted to scream, to wake Natalie, to run, but my legs had no strength. This betrayal wasn't just against my daughter, it was against the years, the trust, the love we had built together. It felt like someone had walked into our family story with muddy shoes and trampled everything. And in the middle of that pain, my first instinct was still to protect my daughter. I didn't know why, but I understood I couldn't tell her yet. Not while she was still sleeping peacefully, not while she was still unaware, not tonight. Because once I spoke, nothing would ever be the same again. What would you do if you discovered such a betrayal, and the victim was your own child? Would you tell the truth? Or stay silent to protect their heart from breaking? There are scents that carve themselves into memory like blades, not the comforting ones: fresh bread, clean laundry, or the cologne my late husband wore when he came home from work and hugged me from behind. I mean the other kind, the ones that never leave, seeping into every room and every thought. Ever since I found that album, I began to notice it. That heavy wood and metal scent, the same cologne, lingering on Edward's neck every time he walked by, the same scent that clung to every photograph with that woman. I could barely breathe whenever he was near. It wasn't just discomfort, it was fear. A slow, sharp fear that pressed deep in my stomach like a stone. Then I started noticing things I used to overlook. The way Natalie lowered her head when he spoke. The cold tone in his voice when it was just the two of them. I wondered how many times had my daughter pretended to be happy just so I wouldn't worry. How many of her smiles were bridges already broken. How many times had she needed me, while I, wanting to respect her space, chose silence instead? Edward still wore that same cologne every day. I could smell it the moment he stepped out of the shower, crisp white shirt collar, leather shoes, polished like mirrors. Some days, he paced while talking on the phone. Other days, he sat in the living room with his laptop, pretending I didn't exist. But I saw him every gesture, every glance, every pause in his breath. I watched him the way one watches a snake. Not because I feared he'd hurt me directly, but because now I knew he could destroy anyone if it served his interests. I'd tried to talk to Natalie several times. I asked if she was okay. She'd answer, "Yes, Mom," in a mechanical voice, eyes still glued to her documents. I saw the exhaustion on her face, the dark circles, the drooping shoulders. I offered to make her tea. She refused. I suggested a walk. Just the two of us. She said, "I have to work." I sat on the sofa, silent, screaming inside. I just wanted my daughter to look at me, to tell me something, to open up even a little, but she seemed farther away than ever, while I was getting closer to a truth I didn't know how to speak. One morning, while washing dishes, because even while recovering from hip surgery, I needed to feel useful, I found a handkerchief in the laundry pile. It wasn't Natalie's, and it wasn't mine. It was a white silk handkerchief with gray trim, embroidered with the initials S.G. I picked it up like evidence in a lab. My hands trembled. I lifted it to my nose, and yes, it was the same scent. That heavy cologne that haunted every hallway of this house. I slipped it into my robe pocket, not knowing why, maybe because I needed something to hold on to, something to keep me sane. Because when no one believes you, even the smallest proof becomes a lifeline. That night, I locked my door. I couldn't look at that album again, but every image, every smile, every written word was etched into my mind. I closed my eyes and muttered like a dark prayer. She doesn't suspect a thing. I stood up, opened the window, and let the cool night air touch my face. I took a deep breath and promised myself I wouldn't sit still any longer. If Natalie couldn't see it, I'd find a way to open her eyes. Because respecting her privacy was one thing, but watching her being betrayed under the same roof I breathed in was another. Edward came home late. I heard the door open and his low voice on the phone. "I can't talk now. I'm at home." He didn't greet me, just went straight upstairs to his office. Natalie was asleep. I stayed awake, like a night guard. I cracked my door open. The light from his office still glowed. I wanted to go there, to confront him, to shatter the silence slowly killing us. But I stopped. Something told me it wasn't time yet. The truth was close, so close, and I just had to wait a little longer. It would reveal itself. The next morning, Natalie brought toast with jam to my bed, as if she knew I was drained. She brushed my hair gently and smiled. "You're the best mom in the world." And I broke inside. Because that was exactly what she used to say, as a child. Every time I bandaged her scraped knees, I looked at her, my eyes full of love, and the pain deepened because I couldn't tell her the truth without breaking her heart. Sometimes, being a mother means choosing to shatter yourself so your child can stay whole. That day, I sat on the porch for hours, staring at Seattle's pale gray sky, listening to the wind rustle through the maple trees. I realized that knowing the truth and staying silent can hurt just as much as being deceived, not from cowardice, but from love. Because truth also needs its own timing, and I knew my moment was coming, though I didn't yet realize it had already begun. Sometimes, pain doesn't come from what people do to you, but from what they stop doing. The words left unsaid, the questions never asked, the eyes that no longer linger on you, During those days, Natalie began to change, not suddenly, but subtly, almost imperceptibly, unless you were her mother. The way she walked, the way she spoke, the way her gaze dropped all signs of an inner battle she couldn't name. But instead of turning to me, she drifted further away. She started speaking to me with irritation, sighing whenever I asked for help, replying curtly, as if I were a burden in her busy schedule. I didn't blame her. In fact, sometimes I understood. I had been that way with my own mother once. Youth is always in a rush, and by the time we grow older, all that remains is regret. But even with understanding, it still hurt. It hurts when the child you once kept alive, with the warmth of your own body, looks at you like an obstacle, as if you no longer have a voice, no longer have a place in their life. I remember one particular day, I had made chicken soup with rice, the dish Natalie loved as a little girl, the one I always cooked when she was sick. I thought that when she came home and smelled that familiar aroma, she would smile, but instead she sighed. "Mom, did you make those heavy dishes? Again?" "I just want a salad." I said nothing. I sat down, served myself a bowl, and chewed slowly. The soup suddenly tasted like shame. When I washed the dishes, my throat tightened, as if I were scrubbing a wound that never healed. Edward didn't come down for dinner, and Natalie had already gone to her room. That night, I wrote again. Another letter, the kind I knew I would never send. I wrote, "I'm learning how to become invisible, without disappearing completely." And I cried, but not like before. No sobs this time, just dry tears that fell inward. The kind that slowly poison your heart. The days that followed turned monotonous. Quiet, a dense silence, as if every emotion had been locked in a drawer with no key. Natalie left the house without saying goodbye. Edward no longer pretended to be polite, and I became a shadow, moving slower, speaking less. Even the bathroom mirror seemed tired of reflecting me. One morning, I looked at my reflection and asked myself, is that really me? That gray-haired woman in a worn-out robe, with sad eyes, was she once the same woman who fought through everything to raise her child alone? I tried to play the piano again in the afternoon, when the house was empty. Natalie once said, I should have it tuned to preserve its value, not because she wanted to hear me play. I pressed a few gentle keys, but the sound was hollow, distant, as if the piano itself knew that music had died in this house. I stopped halfway, closed the lid, and rested my forehead against the polished wood, breathing softly, as if even a deep breath might turn the pain into a cry. In that house, no one asked why you were crying. They only cared whether you were making noise. One afternoon, as I was slowly sweeping the hallway, Edward came down the stairs talking on the phone. He walked past me without a greeting, without even a glance. I heard him say, I can't talk now, she's here. Who was she? Me? Natalie? Or the other woman? Everything felt like a puzzle missing its most important pieces. The harder I tried to understand, the more it hurt, not because of Edward's silence, but because of Natalie's. That silence was heavier than any scream. Because when a daughter stops talking to her mother, it's not just the conversation that breaks. It's the story between them that shatters. That night, I couldn't sleep. I got up for some water and heard a sound in the kitchen. When I walked closer, I saw Natalie eating cereal straight from the bowl, her eyes swollen. I gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She looked at me, then lowered her head. It's nothing, Mom. I'm just tired. But I knew, because what mother doesn't know? My daughter was falling apart, and she wouldn't let me in. She kissed my cheek quickly, then went to bed, leaving me standing in the kitchen with a shattered heart, aching to hold her the way I used to when she was little and feverish. The worst part was I didn't know what to do. Tell her the truth? Show her the album? or stay silent? Should I destroy her world to save her from it? Because a poisonous truth can become a weapon. And I didn't want to be the one to pull the trigger. So I swallowed the truth like I had so many times before. Like when my husband left and I never told anyone how much I cried. Like when there wasn't enough money for Natalie's school uniform and I pretended I'd forgotten. Like when my body was in pain, but I still cooked her favorite meal. This silence was just another one of my many silences, but it hurt in a different way. And then it happened. For the first time, Edward slipped. He dropped his phone on the living room floor. I was rearranging the cushions on the sofa when I saw the screen light up. The wallpaper was clear. It was the same woman from the album, lying by the pool, wearing sunglasses and a white swimsuit. That pool, that smile, that hell disguised as paradise. Edward quickly picked up his phone, pretending nothing had happened, without even looking at me. But I didn't need to see his face. Just that one moment was enough for me to know. The time for silence was almost over. There are truths we don't seek. They find us, slipping into our ears without permission. And once heard, they can never be forgotten. The next morning, I only wanted some water. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the house in Seattle was wrapped in that false calm before a storm. I walked slowly down the hallway, my feet cold against the floor. As I passed the kitchen, I saw Edward's phone vibrating on the white marble counter. It buzzed once, then twice, then 3 times, almost sliding off the edge. Instinctively, I grabbed it. I was about to set it back down when the screen lit up. Without thinking, I held it to my ear. A woman's voice came through, young, confident, airy like a breeze but cold as steel. "Has the old woman left yet?" I froze, breath caught in my throat. Silence. Then her voice came again, sweet enough to chill the blood. "Are you there, my love?" My hands trembled. I shut my eyes and ended the call without saying a word. I placed the phone back down, as if it had burned me. Leaning against the wall, I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. It was her, the woman from the album. The one who smiled like someone who believed she had already won. And I knew. There was no longer any doubt. Everything I'd seen, heard, and written in silence was true. I returned to my room, closed the door, sat on the bed, and cried. Not a sorrowful cry, but the kind that comes from exhaustion, from realizing the home you live in is rotting from the inside out. I wanted to wake Natalie, to shake her, to scream, "Wake up, sweetheart! They're laughing at you." But I couldn't, because I knew that if I spoke, I would shatter not only her heart but mine as well. Sometimes people love their lies so much that anyone who tells the truth becomes the enemy. That day, I lived as if nothing had happened. Cooked, cleaned, sat on the porch drinking coffee. Edward noticed nothing. Natalie didn't either. The world went on as if I hadn't just fallen into a bottomless pit. But inside, I was different, like a ticking bomb. Every gesture Edward made suffocated me. Every word he spoke felt like an insult wrapped in charm. I saw him clearly now, a cold, calculating man, polished on the outside but hollow within. What hurt most was watching Natalie still believe her life was intact. That night, Natalie came home late. She apologized, sat by my bed, gently stroked my leg, and told me she loved me. I heard her, but my heart was empty. Because sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes loving someone means breaking their illusion, but not tonight. I wasn't strong enough. I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering how a lie collapses. Does it crash like thunder, or peel away slowly like old paint on a wall? The next morning was gray and damp. The musty smell seeped in, even though the windows were closed. I got up early to make coffee, but the machine wouldn't work. I checked the outlet, nothing. It was as if the universe itself wanted to keep me awake. I went to the front door to get the newspaper, as I did every morning. But when I turned the key, the door wouldn't open. I tried again. Nothing. A third time, still nothing. Locked from the outside. I rushed to check the other doors. Every single one was bolted. I froze in the hallway, gripping the handle, my heart pounding wildly. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I was trapped, no keys, no control, and the feeling wasn't paranoia. In that moment, I knew with certainty. Someone in this house had realized that I knew too much. I sat down on the stairs, took a deep breath, and for the first time in my life, I felt real fear. Not for myself, but for Natalie. Because if he could go this far, how much further could he go? I tucked the silk handkerchief into my robe pocket, clenched my jaw, and made myself a promise. Tonight would be the last night I ever slept under the same roof as that man. I wouldn't wait for anyone to rescue me. I would leave on my own. This time, I would go with only what little I had left, but with my dignity intact. At my age, I no longer had time to beg for respect, and as the evening sank into silence, I began to plan my escape. Have you ever had to leave a place you loved because of betrayal? Did you leave in silence or scream the truth before walking away? A woman never truly leaves in one night. She's been leaving in her mind long before. She leaves piece by piece with every averted glance, every swallowed word. Every time she's made to feel invisible. I had already left 100 times in my head. I imagined myself walking down the street, holding a small bag, the night breeze brushing my face. I pictured sitting in a park, eating a piece of bread, sipping coffee, watching strangers pass by. I didn't know if I'd be happy, but I knew I'd be free, because some silences chain you tighter than locked doors ever could. That night, I waited until everyone was asleep. Natalie went to bed early, complaining of a headache. Edward stayed in his office, watching a movie with headphones on. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the darkness like a shadow. I took a small bag with my ID, a bit of cash, the medal my mother had given me, and the white silk handkerchief proof, memory, and the symbol of everything we never deserved to suffer. I put on my gray sweater. It smelled of mothballs and memories, then opened the cabinet where I kept my hospital records, prescriptions, and a photo of Natalie at 5 years old. Her hair tied in pigtails, wearing a shirt with a doll printed on it. I took the picture and pressed it to my chest, not out of nostalgia, but to remind myself why I had to protect her. Even if she had no idea. I walked through the living room without glancing at the shelf where the album was hidden. I didn't need to. Those images were already carved into my mind. I reached the front door and tried the handle. Still locked. I wasn't surprised. I headed for the side door down the back hallway. No lock. I opened it quietly, stepped outside, closed it behind me, and knew that from that moment on, there was no turning back. I called a cab on my phone and waited at the corner. The night air was cool, the sky clear. The streetlights cast a soft, amber glow light that couldn't warm, but could keep you company. I sat on the marble step that Edward had installed to make an impression. I let out a small laugh, because at that moment, the only impression I cared about was my own. And for the first time in years, I felt proud of myself. Proud because I didn't scream, didn't break anything, didn't beg. I simply walked away, because sometimes leaving in silence is the highest form of dignity. The cab arrived, an old white car, engine trembling. I got in. The driver, around 50, looked at me through the rearview mirror and asked, "You okay, ma'am?" I nodded, saying nothing. Even though I was certain of my decision, I could still feel something breaking inside me, as if my body understood I had just crossed a line I could never return from. The car began to move. I left behind the manicured street, the perfect garden homes, and the grand facades hiding their elegant deceit. As the car drove farther away, I realized I wasn't just leaving a house, I was leaving the part of myself that had been wounded beyond repair. I told the driver to take me to Linda's house, an old friend from my younger years. We hadn't spoken in ages, but she once told me, "If you ever need a place to stay, come to me." I held on to that promise like a shipwreck survivor clutching driftwood. When we arrived, it was nearly 2 a.m. I rang the doorbell, trembling. Linda opened the door wearing a flannel robe and pink slippers. She looked at me, didn't ask a thing, just hugged me tight and led me inside. And I broke down crying. I cried in Linda's living room, on her blue velvet sofa between lavender-scented pillows, surrounded by framed quotes I used to think were cheesy, but that night, they saved me. I slept longer than I had in weeks. Not because the bed was soft or the house was quiet, trucks still rumbled down the street, but because I didn't have to pretend to be strong anymore, didn't have to protect anyone, didn't have to endure Edward's cologne seeping through every corner like poison. For the first time in so long, I could finally breathe. I woke up around noon. Linda had made a cup of coffee with milk, placed a pastry on the table, and asked, "So, what are you going to do now?" I didn't know how to answer. I just smiled, because for the first time in a long time, I had the right to choose. I stayed at Linda's for a few days, wrote more letters, read the books she lent me, and sat by the window watching people pass by on the streets of Portland. My body still ached, but it was a different kind of pain, the kind that tells you the wound is healing, that the storm has passed. One afternoon, sitting on the porch watching dry maple leaves swirl in the wind, I knew I couldn't stay silent forever. I wouldn't hide anymore. If I was going to break something, it would be the silence. So I made one phone call, the most important of my life. "Natalie, I need to see you." I never thought a meeting with my daughter could make me this nervous. That morning, I got up early and put on a light blue sweater with pearl buttons, the one Natalie once teased me for, saying it made me look older. I dabbed a little perfume behind my ears not to appear strong, but to remind myself that I was still worthy. I called a cab and gave the address of Cafe Vienna, the one across from the Central Park with white marble tables and long green velvet curtains. I chose that cafe because I'd always imagined it as the setting for important conversations, but never thought that there, I'd be about to break my daughter's heart. I arrived early, sat by the window, ordered a cup of red fruit tea and an almond pastry. My hands trembled slightly. Inside my purse was a yellow envelope I'd bought at a stationery shop near Linda's. Inside it was everything. The photos, the handwritten notes, the receipts, proof of the truth. I'd looked at it twice before leaving the house. Each time I closed the envelope, something inside me whispered, "There's no turning back." But another voice, stronger, said, "Now or never, because truth doesn't win by time, but by courage." Natalie arrived 10 minutes later. Her hair was neatly brushed. She wore a crisp white silk blouse and carried a stack of folders in her hand. She smiled when she saw me, but it was a small, tired smile. She sat across from me, ordered an oat milk latte, and said softly, "It's so good to see you, Mom. I've been worried about you." I nodded without replying. I took the envelope out, placed it on the table, and slid it toward her. I said nothing because sometimes words only make the wound deeper. When the pain is too great, silence becomes the only language left. She looked at the envelope, then at me. She opened it. She went through everything. The photos, the handwritten notes, the receipts. At first, her face was calm. Then her lips tightened. Her eyes blinked faster. And finally, the folder slipped from her hands onto the floor. Her fingers trembled. Her breathing changed. No one in the cafe noticed. No one saw my daughter's world collapsing right there on a table for two, with its white tablecloth and shining silverware. No one heard the sound of her heart breaking beneath the soft hum of jazz music. "How long have you known about this?" She asked, her voice low and shaking. "A few weeks now," I answered, trying to keep my own voice steady. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to be sure. And because silence hurt less than watching you hurt like this." We sat in silence. Long pauses between sips of water. After a while, Natalie buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling as if trying to hold back a sob she couldn't contain. I placed my hand gently on her wrist. She didn't speak. Just let my hand stay there. For the first time in a long while, I felt we were still mother and daughter, that love hadn't completely vanished. I whispered, using every bit of strength left in my heart. "I found out by accident, but if I'd stayed silent, I'd have betrayed you more than he ever did." Natalie looked up. Her eyes were red, but dry. She looked at me with a mix of pain and tenderness. She didn't say thank you, she simply nodded. A small, dignified gesture. "Because there are truths you can't thank someone for right away. You can only be grateful for them with time." And I was ready to wait for that time. When we left the cafe, the sun had already disappeared behind the trees in the park. We walked together to the taxi. She didn't say another word. Before the car drove off, she looked at me through the window, not angry, not resentful, just a sad look. The kind of sadness that doesn't ask for explanations, only a quiet space to breathe. And I knew the storm was only beginning. There are conversations a mother never hears, yet feels. Feels with her heart, her soul, her intuition. That night, I knew Natalie would confront him. She didn't call, didn't text, but I could sense it as clearly as if the ground were about to crack beneath me. I went back to Linda's house, put on a soft cotton nightgown, wrapped myself in a wool blanket, and lay down on her old but warm sofa. I tried to read, but the words wouldn't stay in line. My heart was pounding, as if it wanted to escape my chest. I hurt not knowing what was happening, not being able to be with Natalie, not being able to protect her. I pictured the scene over and over for hours. Natalie walking into the house, holding the envelope, closing the door, looking straight at Edward, demanding answers. And as always, he would deny. Pretend to be heartbroken. Maybe even cry, because he was an expert in the art of calculated guilt. He knew exactly when to say what others needed to hear. Some men are like that, I learned too late. They don't kneel out of remorse, but out of strategy. And what scared me most was the thought that Natalie, with her pure heart and boundless faith, might believe him. Around 10 p.m., my phone buzzed. A short message. I confronted him. He said it was all in my imagination, that I'm paranoid. I went numb. Imagination? So now someone else's love had become delusion. The photos, the receipts, the letters, all erased by one cold sentence. My blood boiled. But what hurt most was that Natalie still had doubt. Because doubt doesn't come from what we don't know, it comes from what we can't bear to believe. Sometimes the pain is so great, people would rather think they're crazy than accept they've been betrayed right before their eyes. I texted her back just 4 words. "I'm always with you." Then added another line. "No matter what happens." She didn't reply. 2 days passed with no word. I wandered through Linda's house like a lost soul. Every few minutes, I'd stand by the window, look out, then sit back down, only to get up again. Linda brought me coffee and pastries every morning, but I could barely touch them. In my head, Only one question kept repeating. Will she believe me or him? Because yes, mothers know fear too. Fear of losing their children, of being rejected simply for telling a truth that shatters their hearts. On the third day, worry won. I called, no answer. I texted, no response. So, I decided to go outside for a walk, just to breathe again. I walked through the old streets of Portland, where the ancient trees bent yet stood strong, and the sidewalks were cracked like wrinkles of time. I sat on a park bench, watching couples stroll by, children laughing, women carrying paper bags filled with bread. I wondered, how many of them have ever had to choose as I did between being a mother or a messenger? Between silence or shattering the world of the one they love most? When I returned, Linda had made hot soup. I sat down, ate in silence. And then the message arrived. Just one message, but heavy as 1,000 words. Tomorrow, I want to see you, just the two of us. I understood that Natalie had reached the edge between turning back and moving forward, a place where she couldn't retreat, yet still hurt to step ahead. I was afraid because, after truth comes out, there's usually only the fall, and when a daughter falls, the mother falls, too. We met at a small restaurant inside a fancy hotel downtown, the kind where silverware clinks louder than voices, where the air smells of polished wood and French butter. I chose a table by the window. Outside, the city spun on, unaware that my daughter's world was about to collapse. I wore my pale blue sweater again, not to remember, but because that color made me feel steadier. It reminded me that I was Julie Anderson, 68 years old, a mother, a woman, and a witness to a truth that could no longer be hidden. Natalie arrived on time. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, no makeup, her hair tied up the way she wore it when she wanted to hide from herself. She hugged me, not like a daughter, but like someone clinging to the edge of a cliff. She sat down, ordered sparkling water, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. I didn't rush her. Some silences can't be filled with words, only with presence. Finally, she spoke. I saw everything, Mom, I asked. Him. He denied it, then cried, then blamed me, I asked softly. And you? I doubted, Mom, even if just for a second. When he looked at me with that face, I doubted. She closed her eyes tightly, burying her face in her hands. I took one of her cold, trembling hands in mine and saw myself in her, that same tremor I had when my husband left me, saying he felt grateful but not in love. In that moment, I realized this wound wasn't only Edward's doing. It had begun long ago, maybe in my generation. Maybe I had taught her, without meaning to, how to endure in silence. I don't want him here anymore, she said. What do you mean? I want him gone. Are you sure? Sure. But I'm scared. Scared of what, sweetheart? Of being alone, of failing, of things being beyond repair. I looked straight into her eyes and said slowly, Honey, it's already broken, and it's not your fault. Natalie looked at me, her eyes full not just of sadness, but of shame. And that hurt, most of all, because my daughter was ashamed of being betrayed as if the fault were hers. For trusting, for loving too much, for not seeing it sooner. I held her hand, tightly. You're not alone. But what if when he leaves, I feel empty? Empty. You already feel empty now. At least then, that emptiness will be yours without lies, without the scent of another woman's perfume. She asked for the check without looking at me. She always did that when she needed to control something while everything else was spinning apart. We walked in silence to the elevator. We hugged between the golden mirrors and the soft music. In that embrace, I realized my daughter was no longer a little girl, but she still needed a mother's love. The kind that doesn't judge, doesn't say, "I told you so," just stays. When we reached the door, Natalie looked at me and whispered, "I'll tell him to leave. This time. For good." I touched her cheek, nodded, and silently apologized not for speaking the truth, but for not teaching her sooner that peace is worth more than habit. Going home felt like returning to my body after a long illness. My small house in Portland was the same, the low fence, the wooden door, the sun-faded bricks, but I was different. I opened the door with the old key, heavy in my pocket like an anchor. I stepped inside, alone, pulling the small suitcase Linda had helped me pack. The house smelled of dampness and solitude, but mixed within it was the scent of beginning. I set my bag on a chair in the dining room, sat down, and took a deep breath, my chest filled with something unfamiliar, freedom. At last, I had a place that belonged only to me. I spent the first few days in silence, walking through every room, dusting, opening windows, washing old dishes. The kitchen curtains were still torn, the flower pot still dry, the bathroom mirror fogged yet. Everything seemed to speak to me in a gentle voice, like a home that doesn't blame, only waits. Little by little, I brought life back into this place. I bought new cream-colored curtains with a simple embroidered edge, changed the bed sheets to white cotton, took out my favorite teacups again. Every small gesture was an act of returning. I stopped by the plant shop nearby and bought a red rose bush, carefully choosing one with deep crimson petals and lush green leaves. Proof that I had survived and that I was still blooming. The shopkeeper suggested I pick a larger, fuller plant, but I chose the smaller one, the one with tiny new buds just starting to open. I liked to think that, like me, it still had much left to give. I went home, put on my gloves, grabbed the shovel, and began to dig. The soil was hard and dry, like my heart had been just days ago. But I kept digging with patience, with strength, and with the quiet faith of a woman who has weathered too many storms. I planted the rose right below my bedroom window. I told it that it was home now, that it would grow beautiful, that it didn't need to hurry. I watered it with water mixed with a bit of sugar, just like my mother once taught me. Then I sat down in front of it, watched sunlight filter through its leaves, and thought, I'm here now, alone, but not empty. I wrapped my arms around myself, because for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid to hear my own thoughts. A few days later, I uncovered the piano. I hadn't played since my husband died. But that day, with the windows wide open and the new curtains swaying in the breeze, I felt like trying again. I sat down and pressed a few keys. The sound was faint, but alive. I played an old song, the one Natalie used to sing as a child, and I cried. But not from sadness. I cried from relief, from return, from gratitude, from knowing I was still whole, even with all my cracks. That afternoon, I began thinking about teaching piano again, not for money, but for companionship. Because teaching music is also a way of planting seeds in someone else's heart. I called a neighbor and asked if her granddaughter still wanted to take piano lessons. She said yes, the girl often asked about me. I smiled and told her she could come on Saturday. My neighbor cheerfully hung up, and I sat there looking at the phone, my chest warm as if I had just received a hug. The next morning, while watering the roses, I saw a letter in the mailbox. No sender. Only my name, written in blue ink. I opened it and sat on the old white-painted bench by the door to read. The handwriting was familiar immediately. It was Edward's. He apologized, said he had lost everything, that he understood things too late, that Natalie was the best thing that ever happened to him, that he didn't expect to come back. He just needed to say it to ease his mind. He wrote that he still loved her, and if possible, he wanted me to explain what it was he had never known how to cherish. I didn't feel anger or pity. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: indifference. I folded the letter slowly, stood up, and walked to the back of the garden. I struck a match and set it on fire. When the flame died, I scattered the ashes at the base of the rosebush. "At least do something useful," I whispered, then went back to watering. I wasn't there when Natalie spoke to him, but I knew. I knew by the way my phone vibrated that morning, by the tremor in her voice when she said, "Today's the day." I knew because some decisions are so heavy that a mother can feel them in the air, in her bones, in the silence, when that silence is no longer submission, but the final boundary. Natalie didn't ask me to come, and I didn't offer. Because sometimes being a mother means stepping back, letting your child face what you can't fix for them. Linda made tea and brought me cookies, but I didn't eat. All morning, I sat on the sofa, staring out the window, not at the view or the traffic, but inward, at myself. I imagined every detail. Natalie standing firm, Edward bewildered, the house silent, luxury suffocating under the weight of truth, because when truth walks in, marble, chandeliers, and mirrors lose all their worth. At 5:17 p.m., my phone buzzed. A short, firm message. He's gone. I pictured Edward walking down the stairs, carrying that brown leather suitcase he guarded like a secret. His posture stiff, his face tight, his breath heavy. I pictured Natalie's eyes steady on the outside, trembling inside. That image pierced my chest like a cold needle, because this wasn't just a breakup. It was the collapse of an illusion carefully painted to look like love. The end of a story that should never have been written. I changed clothes, called a cab, and gave the driver Natalie's address. I didn't plan to interfere, only to be close, so she would know she wasn't alone. I got out a block away from her house. From a distance, I saw Edward standing by the gate, his suitcase by his feet, his back straight, still pretending to be in control. He wore a white shirt, the same one from those photos with the other woman. But this time, his cologne wasn't strong enough to hide the scent of failure. A few neighbors watched from their windows. A man taking out the trash pretended not to look. The whole block knew, and Edward knew too. That's why he didn't lift his head, didn't speak, just waited for the car to arrive. A sleek, black car with tinted windows pulled up. The door closed, and he left without apology, without goodbye, without a single sign that he understood the pain he'd caused. A few seconds later, Natalie came out. She wore a gray sweater, her hair loose. Her hands hung at her sides, her eyes dry not from peace, but from exhaustion. I walked toward her, silent. She saw me, then collapsed into my arms. And in that embrace, she broke, not with tears, but with trembling, like a house still standing, after an earthquake but no longer livable. I held her tight, smoothed her hair, and understood this was the real beginning. We walked inside together. Everything looked the same, the furniture, the order, the faint scent of artificial flowers, but the space had changed. There was a new echo, a different kind of emptiness, a freedom that still hurt, but was real. Natalie sat on the sofa, her head bowed, and I stood there, looking at my daughter and thinking, "At last, you've stepped out of the darkness." I went to get her some water. When I came back, she was holding an envelope. "It was in his car. He must have forgotten it," she said. I took it and opened it. Inside were old photographs. The two of them on lavish vacations, dressed in designer clothes, wearing shiny watches, smiling those practiced smiles. At the bottom was a printed sheet, two plain, tickets to Hawaii, in the names of Edward Collins and Sophia Grant. The next morning, thick fog covered the rooftops of Portland, forcing me to turn on the lights even though the sun was up. I woke early, not sure why. I walked barefoot to the kitchen, the floor cold, the house silent. I made coffee slowly, the way I like. As the steam hissed from the machine, I thought about the letter I'd burned the day before, about the strange nature of regret. It always arrives late, wrapped in words that never heal. Edward had written from the shadows, not out of remorse, but out of loss. I sat at the table, holding my steaming cup. Outside, the rose bush stood firm in the fog, soaked but strong. Then the phone rang. I didn't jump. Calmly, I answered. It was Natalie. Her voice was weak, like when she was a little girl with a fever. She said only one sentence. "Mom, can I stay with you for a few days?" I didn't ask, didn't need an explanation. I said, "Of course, sweetheart. You can stay here anytime you want." We hung up. I sat there a little longer, alone with my coffee, and the quiet belief that time always puts things back where they belong. Even if it hurts, even if it costs, the moment will come. That afternoon, Natalie arrived with a small suitcase. No jewelry, no makeup, just her favorite sweater, the one she'd worn since college. We hugged for a long time without speaking. I let her rest her head on my chest, breathing like she used to when she was little. I made chicken noodle soup, and for the first time in years, we ate together, no tension, no lies, no shadows. That night, we shared a bed like during the old stormy nights when she'd crawl under my blanket seeking safety. She whispered, "Mom, read me a story like when I was 5. I found an old book of poems." I read her one, about mothers who never fall. Even when uprooted, Natalie cried quietly, not for him, but for herself. For everything she had endured, for everything she once believed she deserved. I brushed her hair and whispered, "You're not to blame for anything. You just gave too much of your heart. That's not a sin, that's love, and love should never have to hurt." Before sleeping, Natalie said she'd read Edward's letter. She admitted that for one moment her heart wavered, she almost called him. But then she thought of me, of how I had walked away, waited, and still remained the place she could come home to, even after everything. "Thank you for never letting me go," she said. I replied, "I never will. Even if you're angry, even if you're silent, even if you fall, I'll still be here, always." We fell asleep, hand in hand. In the quiet, in the healing, the world outside remained the same, but inside that little house in Portland, something was being mended. The next morning, the rose bush on the porch bloomed its first flower, and I understood some wounds can't be healed by medicine or by time, but by presence, by a gaze, by gentle conversations, and by silences, shared without judgment. The days Natalie spent with me passed slowly, like stitching trust back together thread by thread, with all the things we hadn't said for years. We didn't talk much, but we had each other, and sometimes that was enough. We slept in the same bed, like when she used to be afraid of thunder. She lay on her side, one leg resting over mine, and I gently stroked her hair, saying nothing. In the mornings, I toasted bread while she spread the butter. We sat by the window, watching the rose bush each day. Another petal opened. We talked little, listened more. She told me she couldn't bear the silence of her old house, that she dreamed of her childhood, and was surprised she could sleep so peacefully in my room. One afternoon, we opened the old boxes in the closet. Inside were photos, her childhood dresses, and crayon drawings. Natalie picked up one picture with her name, written in wobbly letters. She stared at it for a long time before asking, "Mom, Was I ever truly happy? Of course, I said. Even on hard days, you were a child who was loved. Then she asked again, "What about you?" I hesitated. Mothers sometimes lie to protect their children, but that day, I didn't. Not always happy. But because of you, I was strong enough to keep going. We held each other and cried, no hiding, no shame, like two women rediscovering themselves in each other. That evening, we watched old movies and ate popcorn. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we fell asleep on the couch. She wore my old flannel robe, the one she used to call ugly, but now refused to take off. And I cooked her favorite meals again: lentil soup, chicken pot pie, and cinnamon-dusted pudding. Every dish was a bridge, every scent a memory rising from the ashes. One morning, while we watered the garden, Natalie stopped in front of the rose bush. The red petals were in full bloom. She bent down and touched one lightly with her fingertip. I said, "This is the most beautiful flower I've ever seen because it grew out of ruins." She looked at me, came closer, and hugged me tight like she did as a child. Then she whispered, "You saved me. I owe you my life." I smiled and answered, "No, sweetheart, I gave it to you the day you were born." That night, when all was calm, I sat at the piano and played a slow tune. Natalie came over, said nothing, and rested her head on my shoulder. We sat there, mother and daughter, imperfect, not entirely healed, but closer than ever. Not every return brings us back to the past. Sometimes we return to the present stronger than ever. And when that happens, we don't need to say a word. Others can see it in the way we walk, breathe, and stand tall without fear. Natalie stayed with me for 2 weeks, 15 days of shared silence, hot tea, and old films. We didn't talk about Edward more than necessary. Some things don't need to be analyzed, only kept at a distance. When Natalie said she wanted to go back to work, her voice was steady, free of guilt. It was her life. But this time, she wasn't running from it. She was choosing to live it. That morning, I watched my daughter get ready. She brushed her hair softly, wore just a touch of makeup, chose a simple beige silk blouse, elegant, modest, and put on the white gold earrings I'd given her on her graduation day. She picked up her black handbag and walked with that same familiar grace she'd had since girlhood. The walk of a woman stepping into the world with confidence, owning herself. Before leaving, she hugged me tightly. A long, firm embrace that needed no words. She promised to visit every weekend, and I believed her. Not because of what she said, but because I could feel it in her arms. That afternoon, I began cleaning out the spare room, the one that had held only boxes, folded rugs, and untouched memories for years. I opened the windows, swept the dust, washed the floor as if I were dusting off my own soul. I placed a few dried flowers in an old red clay vase. Then I turned that room into a small music room, nothing fancy, just sincere. The piano sat in the corner beside a wine-colored rug. On the wall, I hung old sheet music, yellowed with age, still bearing my fingerprints from years ago. I didn't need much, only space and passion. And now, I had plenty of both. I sat down and played for hours. Each note I played felt like waking up again, no longer a betrayed mother, no longer an old woman, or a victim. I played the piano like someone learning to speak again after years of silence. Every key was a word I had never said. And I realized something profound. Silence isn't a refuge, it's a cage. That day, every note I touched felt like unlocking another door within that cage. I could breathe again. The next, Saturday, Sophie arrived, an 8-year-old girl with messy braids and a backpack full of drawings. She sat at the piano with eyes full of light. I taught her how to sit, how to place her fingers, how to listen to sound with her whole body, not just her mind. Each lesson was a beautiful moment, a gentle reminder that I still had something to give. When the first class ended, the little girl hugged me without asking and whispered, "I want to play like you, Miss Julie." I smiled, and inside me, something began to grow again, not sadness, but life. Then, slowly, more students came, a cousin, a neighbor's boy, then Sophie's friend. One told another, and soon everyone knew about the piano lady with the kind smile, the one who tells stories while tuning the strings, offers homemade cookies, and has a garden of red roses. My house was filled once more with footsteps, laughter, and voices, sounds replacing the sighs that used to live in every corner. I bought a chalkboard, a new clock, and another rug. Nothing extravagant, just chosen with the quiet elegance of someone who has survived ruin. One afternoon, while I was sweeping dried leaves on the porch, a young woman walked up. She had sun-kissed skin, wore a denim jacket, and carried a folder. She smiled and introduced herself as a reporter from Portland Local Life. She said someone had told her my story, and she wanted to write about it because it deserved to be shared. I smiled softly and said, "There's nothing special about me." But she was persistent. I brewed coffee, poured it into my old porcelain cups, and we talked. I spoke little, but enough. That I had been a mother, had fallen, had left, and had returned. That I planted a rose because I needed to see with my own eyes that I could still bloom. A week later, she came back with the magazine. On the cover was a black and white photo of my hands on the piano keys, wrinkled but steady. The headline read, "The Woman Who Started Over from Her Roots." I asked her not to print my full name, not out of shame, but because the story wasn't for me. It was for anyone who needed hope that they too could rise again. I looked at that picture for a long time, not with pride, but with peace. That evening, Natalie called. Her voice trembled. I couldn't tell if it was pride or emotion, maybe both. "Mom, your story sounds like a movie," she said. "It's not a movie, sweetheart," I answered. "It's life. And you survived." "No, I lived just in a different way." After we hung up, I sat on the porch. The sky was clear, stars shimmering. I heard the piano, though I wasn't touching it because the music was now inside me. I looked at the rosebush, thinking of everything I had been, everything I had endured, and everything I could still become. And I understood that something was closing not with sobs, but with love. And when a story ends with love, it doesn't need an ending. It simply continues to live. Julie's story is a journey of silence and courage, of pain wrapped in love, and of a mother learning to rise again from the ruins. Though this is a fictional story inspired by real experiences, all names and locations have been changed to protect privacy. Yet the emotions, the fear, the regret, and the faith in healing are completely real. Sometimes we ask ourselves, is silence peace, or just the chain that keeps us in the dark? Julie chose to speak not for revenge, but for freedom. And perhaps, in that very moment of truth, God placed his hand over her heart and gave her the strength to forgive and to live on. If this story touched you, stay to watch the 2 videos at the end. You might just find a piece of yourself within them.